Good morning. My name's Jack Watling. I'm the Research Fellow for Land Warfare at the Royal United Services Institute, and it's a great privilege to chair this panel setting out the challenge that we face in conducting urban operations. I'm minded that Hannibal Barca, the greatest tactical commander, arguably, of his time, spent 10 years dominating the Roman army on the field. And yet, he never achieved operational or strategic success. Why? Because he couldn't take Rome, or any other towns for that matter. The Ottomans, at the time where again and again they routed the Austro-Hungarian forces from the field, were unable to take Vienna, despite trying twice, and for that reason never transitioned from tactical or battlefield success into operational success and victory. The Germans in the Second World War failed to take Leningrad, Stalingrad, and Moscow, and in doing so, similarly, struggled to transition from tactical success to operational success. That's not always been the case in history. During the Napoleonic Wars, battles were often decided on the field. But when we get into certain dynamics of conflict, that ability to win in the urban is critical to actually achieving your campaign goals. And so this panel is going to try and outline why that is such a difficult challenge. And our first speaker to address that issue is Professor Anthony King, who many of you will know, and I'm sure will have appreciated his book earlier this year on urban operations in the 21st century. And he will be outlining the military aspects of the operational challenge that we're here to discuss. So, Tony, over to you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Jack. Thanks very much. Well, I had a few slides, but they seem to have slightly disappeared, but that's no problem. Thanks for inviting me, General Nick. Very kind, very nice to be here, and thanks to Brigadier Story and Paul Robinson for organising. Really good event, and appreciate the invitation. So thanks very much. In the sort of orders for this event, Comart wrote these words: multi-domain operations have the potential to revolutionise how we orchestrate an operational level approach to urban conflict. If we do MDO right, can we bypass aspects of the two-dimensional force-on-force fight? That is what we need to get into today. And following that mission statement, the aim of today was not only to be able to understand the challenge, I'm quoting here, of MDO urban operations, but more importantly, for people to be clear on actions and the next step. So these are the questions, these are the issues I'd just like to have a look at for the next 10 minutes and offer you my own interpretation of some of the issues of MDO and urban, and particularly the question of what do multi-dimensional operations in the urban environment actually look like? Well, let's go to the first point, which is, what is multi-dimensional integration? What are multi-dimensional operations? Well, this theme has already started to be articulated in the previous two talks, and I would say this. Multidimensional operations, multidimensional integration is the attempt to unite and coordinate land, air, sea, cyber, and space into one integrated element. It's the attempt to fuse data from cyber and satellites into conventional joint forces to be able to operate more quickly, more lethally, more accurately, and globally. And if we think of multidimensional operations in that way, what I'd suggest is the moment we start to think of them, a deterritorialization takes place, precisely because a significant part of the enabling element of multidimensional operations don't take place on the ground or in the sea or in the air. There is a deterritorialization. They raise up into this virtual space. And indeed, if we look at recent articulations of the transformations of warfare, we can see this kind of development, this kind of deterritorialization. I give you an excellent article in the Wayville Room recently on multidimensional operations, but it contained this statement. We have the opportunity to develop a reimagined military construct, a whole-of-nation strategic global influencing organization that can project power in all dimensions. it was an excellent article. But note the way in which operations are lifted from the sort of mundane, everyday, concrete reality that humans actually live in. And in the academy today, this deterritorialization is extremely pronounced. Very well-known urban geographer and security studies scholar Derek Gregory talks about the everywhere war, that somehow the combination of satellites, drones, data has made war to become ubiquitous, become mercurial, become able to position and locate itself wherever it wants, whenever it wants. And I must also say here, a colleague and friend, Matt Ford and Andy Hoskins' new book, which is an interesting book on radical war, contains a very interesting sentence. And this is the sentence. In the 20th century, battlefields were located geographically somewhere in the world. Strong implication in the 21st century under multidimensional operations, they are not. We have somehow transcended the mundane, earthly qualities of warfare. What I want to try and articulate in the next few minutes is to maybe bring us back down to earth and to argue that there is a way to do multidimensional operations, but it's a very concrete way. Now, the question then is, where are multidimensional operations most likely to occur? We've already heard it. The urban. 3 reasons. 1, cities are a lot bigger. They provide huge advantage, asymmetric advantages for the defender. And the 3rd reason, which I would emphasize extremely strongly and would point to you that the Ukraine war really demonstrates, as state forces have downsized, they are no longer capable of forming the dense fronts that we saw in the 20th century, and on those fronts in the field where most of the intense battles occurred. As forces have downsized, they have converged on decisive terrain. Where is the decisive terrain located? It is located in urban areas. And if you look at the operations in the Donbass and in Ukraine generally, Russian-Ukrainian forces have converged on these decisive strategic, operational, and tactical pieces of terrain. They are almost always, not always, but almost always located in the urban. So multidimensional operations will tie down into urban areas. They will land from this deterritorialized space in the ether, they will land in urban areas. Now, the question then is, what does the urban battle actually look like? And I'd say there's 2 features of it. Let's talk about the first. The first, the intense localization of the urban battle. Precisely because forces have downsized, there's no longer sweeping fronts that run through cities now into the field. Downsized forces converge inside cities and they fight these hideous urban sieges inside districts and neighborhoods. We can see it in the fight against ISIS, you can see it in the war in Syria, and you can see it in Ukraine in battles like Severodonetsk or Mariupol. Now, the point here is that while this terrible siege attritional warfare is going on at street level, there is absolutely a multidimensional element. Let me give you one example. If you look at the Battle of Mosul, there was terrible fighting at street levels as Iraqi forces fought and struggled to take building by building Mosul. Yes, but above them, flying to 60,000 feet, was a series of aircraft sensing, striking ISIS forces, and above them were satellites targeting, gathering information about ISIS fighters. And simultaneously, intelligence organizations were looking into cyberspace, open source, to gather intelligence. And what intelligence they gather? They tried to work out where the factories and the people making the armored IEDs that were the biggest threat to ISIS forces were actually being made. And so out of this multidimensional architecture, very precise actions were able to be taken seriously to degrade the capability of ISIS in the close fight. And we see exactly the same in Ukraine. Look at the significant attrition of Russian generals. Major General Simonov, for instance, around Izium, killed on the 30th of April. Valery Gerasimov was putatively wounded in the same attack. This is an urban multidimensional operation. Hideous fighting in and around Izium, but coordinated through air sensors, sensors in the electromagnetic sphere, sensors in cyber, open source, and satellite imagery. Ukrainian forces were able to mount a targeted strike on a Russian command post. So what we see is extraordinary localization at the street level, linking into this remarkable architecture, expanding into the airspace and, of course, into cyberspace. Second point about the urban battlescape. Even as it localizes in the most remarkable way to actual particular streets and villages and particular buildings, it also globalizes outwards. So it globalizes out, the ripples of the fight resonate out across an urban archipelago. Let me just give you one example. If you look outside this window, you can see Chelsea Football Club. I put it to you that Roman Abramovich was part of the initial bit of the Ukraine war. So even while Ukrainian forces were struggling to defend Kyiv, which they did with an outstanding way, there is a second battlefront here with I can say in this audience, with a corrupt member, distant member, but still a member of Putin's regime, located concretely at Stamford Bridge. And what we see in terms of operations is therefore a radical localization, but also a dramatic globalization. And of course, if you want to do military, multidimensional operations as a military force, it is reimagining yourselves so that one is capable both of fighting that local fight and also fighting the global fight. So here's my conclusion. Will the ARC be able to do multidimensional operations? Yeah, I think it will. And 2 points I'd say. Firstly, multidimensional operations will not obviate the requirement for the close urban fight. It's a depressing thing to have to say, but all the analysis that I would point to points in that direction. If you are confronted with a determined, well-equipped enemy, well-trained enemy, if you are taking or defending urban areas, multidimensional operations will absolutely assist you in that close fight, and they'll be utterly essential to be effective in that close fight, but they won't obviate the need for that hideous street fighting that we've seen in Ukraine, that we saw against ISIS, and that we saw in Syria. Second point, how will the ARC do multidimensional operations? Well, here the import of my talk is clear. The ARC, I put it to you, will be best able to do multidimensional operations if it thinks locally, if it actually grounds operations in real geography, focuses on real geographic operational problems, and seeks to link what those close forces in that hideous urban fight are going to need to do in Eastern Europe, in Northern Europe, on the northern flank, and link that close urban fight with this developing, complicating architecture of air power, sea power, but also, crucially, digital cyber domains with space. If NATO is able to do that, I think they will be able to be very capable of defending Europe against Russian aggression and Russian actions. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Tony. Now, of course, the challenge in urban operations, or at least one of the most important ones, is that a majority of the people involved in that battle space are probably not military personnel. And so our next speaker, Sahr Muhammedally from the Center for the Protection of Civilians in Conflict, is going to discuss that flank that is so critical to both the information war that Tony highlighted, but also to our obligations in moving into the urban space. Sahr, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for inviting myself. I represent the organization Center for Civilians in Conflict, CIVIC. And thank you, General Barton and Brigadier Story. And also some of the remarks so far this morning have set up the stage very well for me to sort of highlight some of the challenges in urban operations that impact civilians. And my comments reflect my own experience on the ground in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen, and also reflect my colleagues who are operational and working in Ukraine. And I know that's a key conflict that everybody is monitoring closely. And as Professor King said, in terms of articulating how multi-domain operations can be leveraged in urban environments, and as was also said earlier, it's because today's armed conflicts are fought in urban areas, and they're affecting over 50 million people. And urban areas are vulnerable to the effects of conflict because they are the centers of gravity for civilian life. And within this very complex, dynamic modern conflicts, the risk to civilians and civilian objects grows exponentially in urbanized environments. And we've seen some of that live streamed with the conflict in Ukraine, but we've also seen the impact on civilians and critical infrastructure in Iraq and in Syria. And I think it creates a lot of challenges for belligerents to comply with the law of armed conflict, also your own domestic policies, as well as a NATO protection of civilians policies. And so sort of my remarks are sort of focused on how the density of the population, how the terrain, how the infrastructure has to be taken into account from a planning perspective and identifying risks to civilians and civilian objects. We know that in most cities, despite what people and military planners may think, some part of the civilian always remains. We also know that essential services that civilians rely on, such as hospitals, electric power grids, water supply sources, are, if they get degraded or destructed, they in fact impact quality of life and lead to death and injury of civilians. We are seeing, at least through Ukraine, but we've seen this also in the anti-ISIS campaign, that the urban environment favors the defender, even if the attacking force is technologically and materially superior, as the terrain makes it difficult to identify military objectives. And of course, such complexities are compounded by available munitions, such as the use of explosive weapons with wide area effect, which have devastating consequences for civilians and infrastructure when they're used in urban areas. So therefore, understanding the urban environment, including the terrain population and the technology, is essential for military planners to both think about the risk to civilians and civilian objects during an attack, and also defending civilians from the effects of an attack. And in our increasingly technological world, understanding cyberspace and information technology, and such as telecommunications, internet, computer systems, cellular phones, social media, is also very critical, because a lot of life-sustaining functions in urban areas are data dependent. So sophisticated cyber attacks can disrupt the provision of essential services that are essential to the survival of the civilian population, including healthcare, electricity, energy, and water supply systems. And thankfully, we haven't seen any major cyber attacks, but there have been cyber attacks. So it's about governments and military planners thinking about developing cyber resiliency to protect critical infrastructure from such attacks. We've also seen that the mention of space and multi-domain is also going to involve space and the use of satellite. And Professor King, you mentioned the use of satellite in the anti-ISIS campaign, and it's also being leveraged in Ukraine. Elon Musk's Starlink is being used to help civilians, and so that electricity and power grid is using the satellite. But there's also reports that it's being used to for targeting purposes, to target Russian military objectives. And therefore, there are sort of questions where a private satellite company could be a dual-use object, and then could be subject to military attack. And again, me coming from a legal background, the legal advisors in the room would also have to think about these kind of measures that should be taken when, again, using these dual-use infrastructure that are also in space, and what some of the challenges are when a private company is also sort of involved in that. Advances in artificial intelligence are being integrated into military capabilities, which could, of course, lead to a degree of operational autonomy, but also introduces new risks of civilian harm. And the growth of Internet of Things can expand attack services and range of vulnerabilities. But also there are some research is being done on the positive uses of AI in rendering precautionary measures and identifying civilian objects to, again, aid in the distinction of civilians and combatants. And I think leveraging these new capabilities needs to be balanced with the effects on civilians and civilian objects. So we sort of advocate for a civilian harm mitigation approach to assess risk to civilians, to allow for planning, execution, response, and lessons learned in order to reduce risk to civilians before, during, and after operations. I think there's a, this is propaganda here. I'm just like, there's a booklet on each table which basically looks at some of the military challenges in urban environments and what some consideration military planners can take to mitigate civilian harm. It's also available online, but there's a copy on the desk, on the tables. But as you know, again, when we think about large-scale combat operations, which involve many divisions and corps, I know they can be, they include invasions, declaration of war, activation of NATO 5, NATO Article 5 operations, or even limited contingency operations, as we saw in Mosul and Iraq. But these operations are likely to occur in urban areas and will have access to aerial, littoral, or seaport, and will be near cities, and it requires occupation of seizure to support deployment and maneuver. So no matter what people say that you can bypass cities, that's just not the reality. And again, given the heightened risk to civilians' infrastructure, having a population-centric intelligence preparation of the environment can better assist in the planning, preparation, and courses of action to mitigate civilian harm. So positioning protection of civilians and reduction of civilian harm as strategic goals and operational tasks better enables the resourcing with the same level of effort as engaging military objectives. The preparation phase can include information on population, ethnicity, infrastructure, interconnectedness, and the courses of action civilians are likely going to take when the kinetic operations begin, on their street. Continuous analysis of civilian behaviors feeds into pattern of life analysis, which again feeds into better analysis on how to distinguish between civilian and military objectives. And I know, ISRs has been used very effectively in the last decade or so, but in a contested environment against a peer or near peer, you cannot rely on ISRs alone. Because it could be degraded. So using alternative sources, analog systems, and using open source intelligence should be useful to better develop a comprehensive understanding of the operational environment. It's also very useful to analyze adversary tactics that put civilians at risk and can contribute to mass casualties, the use of CBRN, toxic forces, contamination, all needs to be analyzed from the lens of mitigation and risk mitigation. And I just have a couple of minutes, I want to mention briefly disinformation. Of course, disinformation is as old as warfare, but it has been enhanced due to the use of social media, and we've seen how disinformation has been used very effectively in Syria and in Ukraine, and it can lead to escalation on conflict. It has led to attacks on the neutrality of humanitarian actors, vigilante attacks. It can also lead to mass atrocities, and again, it has a lot of strategic effects on adversaries. So thinking through disinformation, what measures need to be taken to counter this is really important from a planning lens. And then as militaries transition from counterinsurgency operations to large-scale combat operations, there's a lot of writing, et cetera, from military operators and planners who are focusing on LISCO as being chaotic, intense, and highly destructive than we've seen in decades. Although I would argue the destruction that we're seeing in current conflicts is chaotic and highly destructive. We saw that in Iraq, we saw that in Syria, we're seeing that in Ukraine. And so there's a lot of, again, chatter and conversations about you need to shift armed forces from this population-centric counterinsurgency to an enemy-centric operation. But again, we would just have to look at the daily news coming out on what an enemy-centric population looks like. So it's important not to cast aside measures to protect civilians as a vestige of counterinsurgency era. But military should take steps now, while the time allows, to adapt, plan, train, and adopt tactics and tools to better protect civilians in scenarios which they may find themselves fighting in densely populated areas like the capitals of the Baltic states or even Taiwan. And finally, commanders should not be seduced by the myth of technology that could seem to make decision-making in war a bit easier. I mean, you can blame the algorithm. In the end, leadership matters, and ethics matters. And the tactical choices governments, militaries take have strategic effects. And that's what makes difference in war. And I think it's really essential to balance military necessity with the constant care obligation to spare the civilian and civilian objects from the effects of harm. And that should animate all strategic, operational, and tactical decision-making. So I'll stop there, 1 minute to spare, and I look forward to the questions.
One of the eternal challenges of the interaction between militaries and that civilian population, of course, is that while civilians are protected, they're very rarely neutral. They often participate, whether that is spotting, enabling logistics, and conducting medical activity in support of the armed forces operating in their area. And whenever militaries enter urban areas, there are really difficult ethical and legal questions that arise. Our next speaker, Abby Zeith from the International Committee of the Red Cross, is going to unpack some of those legal issues in terms of the obligations, constraints, and opportunities that forces must navigate when they enter urban areas. Now, I would just like to very quickly flag that Abby has generously stepped in at about 20 minutes' notice because her colleague, Chris, who was going to be speaking, unfortunately has COVID, something that is still plaguing us, even if our attention has moved on. And so, Abby, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. I just want to say a big thank you very much to ARC, General Borton and Brigadier Story for allowing me to sub in for my counterpart, Chris Hall, this morning. He's the senior delegate working for the ICRC in Brussels, and he is the ICRC's main counterpart with a number of NATO headquarters. So I'm sure that it would have been much better for you to listen to him than me, but I will do my best. He wrote the speech, so all credit to him. I'm a legal advisor working in the Arms and Conduct of Hostilities unit for the ICRC in Geneva. I specialize in urban warfare and large-scale combat operations. Before joining the ICRC, I had the privilege of spending about 10 years in the Australian Army, both as a signals officer and then a legal officer. But I did max out at the rank of major, and so standing in front of all of these stars here does give me nerves. Also, following my counterparts, Sahr and Anthony, also give me a lot of nerves too, given that I have read their stuff religiously on urban warfare. So I'm going to talk briefly about the protection of civilians in urban conflict. I know our colleagues, both in Brussels and in Geneva, we really do appreciate the dialogue that we have had with Headquarters ARC this year, as well as the various NATO headquarters. We really do value the opportunity to participate in NATO education, training and exercises. And indeed, we, and in particular Chris, look forward to seeing a number of you again in the autumn with some thought-provoking scenarios as part of your exercises. Now, my fellow presenters have underlined the increasing likelihood and even the inevitability of fighting in cities in the future. We know the devastating humanitarian consequences. You have seen them well and truly. They are, as we've heard, impacting 50 million people worldwide across the globe. Now, we are all aware of the direct effects of hostilities that lead to civilian death and injury and destruction, and much of that has been caused by heavy explosive weapons, as Sahr has said. And beyond that, we need to think about those direct consequences, such as the essential services issue, where we see those types of services that sustain life and are disrupted and degrading with large-scale reverberating effects. Now, no civilian's experience of conflict in cities is the same. They are, and it really differs depending on whether they remain in the city at war, cross front lines, or become displaced. We see people that are being displaced on an enormous scale. Those remaining under siege are often left with insufficient shelter, food, water, electricity, and healthcare. We are seeing indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks at large scale, and also deliberate attacks both against civilians and civilian objects, as well as deliberate misuse of essential services by belligerents as part of their strategy. Now, once the fighting is over, unexploded ordnance and the lack of access to that essential services prevent the civilians from returning, and often for decades. States have the primary responsibility for respecting and ensuring respect for international humanitarian law, and in our view, they are often falling short. The complexity and the scale of the humanitarian consequences in cities create unprecedented needs, and the ICRC has made urban warfare an institutional priority. Through our work, we combine assistance, protection, and prevention activities that are specifically adapted to the urban context. We have over 20,000 staff in 80 conflicts across the globe and a budget of over 2 billion Swiss francs. But when entire urban systems fail, the consequences far exceed that which can be addressed by humanitarian action alone. Improving assistance has meant that we, as humanitarian actors, have had to forge new relationships with development actors and increasingly specialised capabilities, and we work really closely alongside our national Red Cross and Red Crescent societies, who are often our first responders in urban warfare. We do things like fixing areas filled with unexploded ordnance, weapon decontamination, fixing urban infrastructure, and cash distribution. Now, providing assistance is very visible, but preventing and protecting civilians from harm in the first place, of course, would be better. So there's a parallel effort to improve belligerents' behaviour in urban conflict, and we do that through best practice policy and legal frameworks. Now, every nation accepts that there must be a balance between humanity and military necessity that imposes limits on how warfare is to be conducted. Of course, you will have all heard the three key cardinal principles: distinction, proportionality, and precautions. They protect the civilians from the effects of fighting, but we have heard how complex and the interconnected nature of urban environments make it really hard to comply with these basic principles. But it is precisely for this reason that we think those rules are the most critical in such environments, and it's critical that these norms are established and maintained. For a number of years, the ICRC has analysed how states prepare for, train, and conduct their military operations in urban areas, and we have observed that militaries have shortfalls in urban doctrine, training, force structures, weapons, and equipment design. And I'm sure many of you in this room are very familiar with that. Last year, the ICRC published a Commander's Handbook on reducing civilian harm in urban warfare. So I'll have to show a bit of propaganda now as well. We have it available in a number of languages. It was prepared with military input and designed for a global audience, and much of the content in here will be familiar with those working in NATO headquarters, particularly because we had extensive conversations with a number of you, and we are very grateful to ARRCADE for your support with helping with this guide and the constant dialogue that we have had with them, as well as a number of the folks in the audience, including John Spencer in the crowd and Sahr. So there are a number of key recommendations that we focus on. Urban doctrine needs to highlight protection of civilians, and it should be weighted alongside mission accomplishment and force protection equally. More guidance is also needed for engaging in dialogues with your adversary, but also with other actors, particularly the host nation and impartial humanitarian organisations like our own. Doctrine is also required on the conduct of safe evacuations, screening, the delivery of healthcare, and restoration of essential services. Specialised training is required with an equal focus on fighting in populated areas where civilians are a major consideration, and fighting in built-up areas where terrain is the key factor. Planners need to consider human security in greater detail. You need to develop civilian perspectives and courses of action alongside your own and the adversaries, recognising that your own and others' misinformation and disinformation limits the ability of civilians to take measures to protect themselves. Now, during operations, IHL must of course always be applied. Those who plan and decide upon attacks need to take into account all reasonably foreseeable harm caused by their attacks. This isn't just the direct effects caused by munitions. It is those reasonably foreseeable indirect or second and third order effects that are to be expected when fighting amongst a city and a population. Now, our handbook ends with a list of best practices, which I need not go into here, other than make a special mention of the importance of civilian casualty tracking mechanisms in understanding the scale of the humanitarian consequences. Best practices are complemented by policy and legal frameworks. NATO and other nations, including the UK, have developed policies to minimise civilian harm. Driven by operational experience, legal, humanitarian and pragmatic impulses, the NATO Protection of Civilians policy and military concept to avoid, minimise and mitigate the negative effects of armed conflict on civilians is an important and welcome framework. ICRC fully supports your efforts to operationalise it through directives, doctrine and training. Of some concern with the increasing focus on collective defence, there appears to be a feeling that such protection frameworks are not relevant and that there's this gloves come off mentality, a phrase that we have heard in various NATO events. Yes, there is a renewed interest on peer conflict, obviously, rather than urban counterinsurgency, but the frame of reference is not World War II. The applicable law was developed after 1945 to prevent unnecessary harm. POC policies do reflect this, and military action in urban areas will continue to be subject to significant legal, moral and policy constraints on weapons and tactics, even if your adversary acts without regard for its IHL obligations. After all, if in NATO territory, the host nation will be very concerned about harm caused to its civilian population and infrastructure, and this has implications for operations in the MDO era, and beyond simply complying with IHL. There will be a debate about civilian resilience, about evacuation ahead of the conflict, and whether NATO forces should forego the defensive advantages of battle in urban terrain to avoid the negative consequences on the civilian population and infrastructure. Sieges and encirclement tactics, which we've heard Anthony speak about, result in very high civilian death tolls and widespread suffering. We have seen it in urban conflicts across the globe, particularly in the last few decades. Starving civilians as a tactic is, of course, prohibited, but civilians also become trapped in encircled areas and they must be allowed to leave. They cannot be trapped, and in some cases, a temporary evacuation might be required. When they flee a besieged or encircled area, those civilians need to be received under satisfactory conditions, and security measures such as screening must be conducted with full respect for the law and under a high degree of scrutiny. Now, these types of operations, like screening and evacuation, demand a high degree of sustainment planning and civil-military cooperation. This is something that is not often practiced or not practiced enough. If urban conflict cannot be escaped and temporary removal of the civilian population through warnings and evacuation is impossible, then when you are fighting in the urban areas, you must take all feasible measures to avoid or minimise civilian harm. Because most militaries remain optimised for manoeuvre in the field and not in urban areas, there is a particular humanitarian concern with explosive weapons in populated areas, large bombs, artillery, and most mortars. In urban areas, these are likely to have significant indiscriminate or disproportionate effects and cause a wide number of casualties. Now, contrary to what some believe, the ICRC is not calling for a ban of these weapons. However, they are ill-adapted to urban use, in our view, and they should be avoided as a matter of policy. That means that they should be avoided unless sufficient mitigation measures are taken to reduce the wide area effects of these weapons. Now, earlier this year, we also published a rather comprehensive report detailing a number of mitigation measures that are taken to reduce the effects of a weeper. NATO's practices are mentioned in here as some good practices, but also there are some areas for improvement. Last month, we saw the conclusion of a diplomatic process on a political declaration for a weeper, and we welcome the final text that was adopted, and we also welcome the intention to endorse it by a number of NATO states. It is a significant step towards protection of civilians and respect for IHL. Now, I realize I'm close to time. I have a couple of points left, but I just wanted to mention future weapons and tactics which often have the potential to reduce civilian harm or increase it. Now, the draft MDO concept suggests that precision and low collateral damage munitions linked to artificial intelligence decision support systems and swarming or autonomous weapon systems offer the potential for a better intelligence picture than human-driven processing, increased lethality, and a reduced risk to friendly forces. Now, this may be the case, but there are legal and ethical concerns over the use of autonomous weapon systems. And so if this technology does allow for more operations, which might have been previously too costly or unpalatable or unlawful, then the cumulative effect of the use of these systems are not going to be less harm to civilians, but in fact more. So this is where it is really important, as Sahr said, that commanders set the scene, they set the pace, and they need to show that protection of civilians' mindset that looks beyond the short-term military advantage is really key here. Finally, on cyber and space, a reminder that these operations don't take place in a legal vacuum. An increasing number of states recognize that international law applies in cyberspace, and the expected effects of cyber attacks, which cannot be directed at a specific military objective or cannot be controlled, are inherently indiscriminate and therefore unlawful. Similarly, with civilian and humanitarian reliance on space-based technology, it is important that all foreseeable direct and indirect civilian harm as a result of space-based operations be considered. Finally, just to wrap up, I know I'm over time, I'm sorry, Chris probably timed this better than me. Urban conflict is an institutional priority for the ICRC. We have seen its increasing prevalence across the globe, and particularly in the last few decades. We continue to adapt our own response to address both the behaviour of belligerents and the humanitarian needs of the civilian population. Multi-domain operations may increase lethality and military effectiveness in urban conflict, but it's not necessarily the case that they will reduce civilian harm. And this is why we emphasise that a good faith and protective interpretation of those key IHL rules and your existing protection of civilians policy that NATO has adopted is vital. The gains in understanding from the last 2 decades of urban conflict must not be lost as we look forward to a future, we not look forward to it, but as we move forward to possibly a future of large-scale combat operations. Protection of civilians needs to be central to the development of new capabilities and the way in which warfare is conducted. Thank you.